you want to hold to the end of the, I don't know.
Yes. If you have questions, I'm going to have Harry pass out some pieces of paper, and as well as a paper that talks about the mission statement of Precious Prodigal and the 4 core beliefs. And if you want to take notes as we go along, I have something for you to take notes on as well. I'll start, while he's passing those out, I'll start by introducing myself and telling you what Precious Prodigal is about. My name is Rita Moritz, and Harry is my husband. We have been married about, let's say, 13 years this year, second marriage for both of us. And between us, we have 7 children and 22 grandchildren. I mean, it's a mess of folks. And a couple of years ago, let me say first, I teach in the court referral program, and I have worked with some women from a halfway house and helping them to get some re-entry skills to go back into the community. But I know more about prodigals from my own experience and from my own children, perhaps, than I know from anything else. Teaching in the court referral program, and I will say this later as I go along, I stopped being surprised when the families or children or spouses or sisters or brothers or friends and church members show up in my classes, because having a prodigal, and that's loosely defined as somebody who is acting out in destructive ways. In the year 2013, that probably includes alcohol and drugs, but it doesn't necessarily have to. But that's why...
What is a prodigal?
The Bible description of a prodigal is the story of the prodigal son who went out into the far country and, asked his father for his inheritance and went and wasted it on wine, woman, and song, and then eventually was restored to the family. But a prodigal doesn't necessarily have to go away to another country, sometimes I suppose, but it's that person in your family, in my family, in the family of every person I have ever met. There's one person who is breaking the hearts of the rest of the family, and that's the person that my book is about. And as I've been writing this book, I started writing a blog, and Harry has done my social media platform, and I have just been astounded at what God has done. I just am astounded. A friend of mine used to say, God is so hard up, Rita, he'll even use you, and I have certainly found that to be true, that God uses broken things and God uses broken people. I want to thank Brandon for inviting me to come, and I want to thank the Lions for having me. One of the first things I want to say is, when Colonel Steve opened in prayer, he said if Jesus were alive, he would be a lion, or if Jesus were here, he would be a lion. But Jesus is a lion. He's known as the Lion of Judah in the Bible. So Jesus absolutely was, is, and will be a lion. The other thing I want to say about the Lions is I want to say thank you. When I was a little girl and my folks were divorced and there was never enough money, the Lions paid for my classes. And I've never forgotten that. It's why you might want to cut this part from the tape, Harry, but I can always walk by the Salvation Army without putting money in the bucket, but I can't walk by a lion and not put money in the bucket, because they live what they say. They just do. And as a little bitty girl, I remember my vision being about 2,400 and not being able to see, and the Lions providing, paying for the doctor's visit and paying for my glasses, and I've never forgotten that. The problem, let me just say first, the problem of loving a prodigal is a common one, and let me say, I just usually start with a joke, but oh my goodness, there's not a joke in the world that I could come up with that would be more impressive or more of an icebreaker than just saying what a big debt I owe to the Lions myself. I'm going to start just with a quick verse of Scripture, and I will quote Scripture as I go along. Let me say about the things that you have. There's some paper, there's some blank paper, and if you have questions and you want to go ahead and write them down, I will answer them at the end, or we can just have a question and answer, open question and answer if you want to do it that way. 1 Peter 4:12 says, "Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you as though some strange thing had happened unto you." First thing I want to just tell you is the number of prodigals, if you will, or the number of families that are hurting over a loved one who has broken the family's heart, who has gotten away from everything that they were raised to believe, who has broken mom and dad's heart, whose heart has been drawn away into or with something else, is about 100%. I'm trying to think of one person I have ever spoken with, or who has ever spoken with me, that did not love a prodigal, and I can't come up with one. If you do love a prodigal, you are certainly not alone. In the state of Alabama, well, in the United States, there are 6 million children who live with grandparents or other relatives. 6 million children. For 2 million of those kids, there is no parent at all present, not even one. In Alabama, only 1 in 3 kids lives with both their parents. Are the divorce rates the same? You're going to hear varying things, and it kind of depends on the circumstances. Professing Christians, whether they are Catholic, whether they are Baptist, whatever they are, usually have as high a divorce rate as the non-Christians. By the way, there's a bird that lives in here, just in case you didn't know. The divorce rate is about the same until you put in their active church attendance, and if they're involved in their community, if they're involved in their church, then those divorce rates do drop drastically. But the way it is right now, it's everywhere. Drug and alcohol use and abuse are on the rise, and you heard, I've already said, I teach in the court referral program. That means if somebody gets a DUI or an alcohol or drug-related offense, domestic violence, all of those things that can be associated with that, and a judge feels that they will benefit from classes or some combination of classes and treatment, those are the classes that I teach. And I've stopped being surprised when people I know show up in there. I've stopped being surprised when your children, your grandchildren, the sisters, the brothers, the preachers' kids, I've stopped being surprised at that because it's everywhere. It's a tough world that we live in.
Where are the classes taught? In the jail?
No, they are not taught in the jail. They are taught down, you know where the Love Pantry is, the building the Love Pantry is in Pell City. They are taught there. Levels 1 and 2 are taught there. Level 3 classes include outpatient treatment, intensive outpatient treatment, and those are done at New Pathways here in Pell City. One of the things that I have heard from parents, from grandparents, from husbands and wives, from sisters and brothers, and interestingly enough, from kids who have parents who are prodigals, is that there are some things you can do and there's some things that you can't do. And I'm going to talk briefly about what you can do. And if you want to follow along with your notes, did he give them to you? He didn't give them to you. You are not a good secretary, just so you know. One of the first things that you can do, let me tell you, the things that you can do are pretty limited, because if you're hoping that I'm going to tell you how you can fix that person in your life that's acting out, I can't tell you that. But I can tell you how you can survive and maybe even thrive, no matter what is going on in your life or in the life of somebody that you love. One of the first things that you can do is you can stop blaming yourself. You know, in Ezekiel 18, the Bible tells a story about, through the prophet, where God said to the people, I've heard it said of old that the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. And God said it's going to cause that not to be a proverb in Israel anymore. It's very similar to our saying, the apple didn't fall very far from the tree. But the bottom line is, God holds each person individually responsible for his or her own behavior. And it was almost 20 years ago, I wrote an article for Educational Leadership Journal. And during that time, I interviewed teachers, and I interviewed parents, and I interviewed pastors of churches, and I interviewed people at treatment centers. And I found the preachers blamed the families for not being faithful. The teachers blamed the churches for not teaching what they should teach, and the parents for not training their children. The parents blamed the churches for not showing up. And you do know that God's army is the only army in the world that shoots its wounded, right? You do know that. I mean, that's a sad but true statement. But the parents blamed the school for not getting the job done, the preachers for not getting the job done, and nobody blamed the kids. There's something wrong with a picture when a kid that won't stay in school is given a pass while the parents are arrested and put in jail because their kid won't go to school. There's a problem with that. God holds each person individually responsible. I have 6 children of my own. I've got a couple who were prodigals and aren't prodigals. I also have 2 daughters, both of whom have their master's degree. Margie got her master's at Tuscaloosa, Roll Tide. She'd get me if I didn't say that. And her master's is in special education, and she has devoted her life to giving back. She had her undergraduate in social work and her graduate degree in special ed. My daughter Michelle is a Christian counselor. She has her own counseling center. And you know the funniest thing, Colonel Steve, when I went to see them get their master's, and I was all ready for them to call my name, but they didn't do that. They called Margie's name, they called Michelle's name. And the reason is because I didn't deserve their master's degree. They had gotten that master's degree through their own efforts. So and I love when Margie and Michelle come to hear me speak. They aren't here tonight, but I love when they come to speak because I always point them out and we all clap for them. But the bottom line is, if I am not to take credit for what they did, why am I to blame for the wrong choices that my kids have made? And why are you to blame for the wrong choices your kids have made? This is not payback for the things that you did do or you didn't do. You are not to blame. We live in a fallen world and people make choices, often wrong choices. And you know, Groundhog Day worked great as a movie, but in real life, you can't do it over and over and over again. I mean, you make your choices and you live with the consequences. Another thing that you can't do, and I will be sensitive of the time, maybe. I'll try. You can recognize that when one member of a family begins to act out, the whole family gets sick. If alcohol abuse or drug abuse is happening in a home, the entire family gets sick. Kicking the bum out is not going to solve the problem. What usually happens is somebody else gets on the merry-go-round. One lady told me, because she would call everybody and get everybody in turmoil every time her husband drank, and she finally said to me, well, Miss Rita, he drinks and I get crazy, and I couldn't have said it better. Especially when substance abuse is involved, the whole family gets sick. Speaking of substance abuse, another thing that you can do is, if substance abuse is involved, you can educate yourself. There are support groups. Celebrate Recovery. Their 120 group is an incredibly good group, and it's not just for somebody who is abusing substances. It's for people who are hurting or people who need help in any way. There's also open AA meetings if alcohol or drugs are a problem. Al-Anon Overcomers and some other groups. And there are books available. You can also stop enabling. And when is helping not helping? Enabling is when what's your name? Deb. Okay, if I do for Deb what Deb can do for herself, or should reasonably be able to do for herself, then I'm not helping her, I'm hurting her. If I'm paying Deb's electric bill, if I am bailing her out of jail, if you're not going to jail, right? But, you know, if I'm going and getting her car out of impound where she got a DUI, I'm not helping her. It was interesting because I had a classroom full of students, and this little lady came up and knocked on the door, and she was looking to give me some money. I would love it, but it wasn't really for me. She wanted to get her son out of jail. And you know, she had to have been in her 70s, I guess. And as she started, we told her where she could probably go. And as she started to leave, I said, ma'am. And she said, yes. And I said, just a second. Hey, listen, guys, by a show of hands, I had about 19 or 20 students in there. By a show of hands, how many of you think she ought to leave them in jail and go home and just take a nap? And they all raised their hands. And these are the kind of people that folks are getting them out of jail. I've had people from the halfway houses tell me it wasn't that my parents didn't love me. They did love me. They almost loved me to death. Sometimes helping is not helping. Now, let me say this. You can only do what you can do and stand as firm as you can stand. If I get a phone call when I get home from my son or my daughter, and their electric has been turned off, and my grandchildren are in that house, do I know it's enabling? Yes, I do. Am I going to pay the electric bill? Yes, I am. Because you can only do what you can do. This is not about what you should do to take care of your son, your daughter, your sister, your brother. It's about what you have to do to take care of yourself. And if you cannot leave that electric off and go to bed tonight and sleep, then pay the electric bill. Just understand that sometimes helping is hurting rather than helping. You can also continue to do the right thing yourself. That's not as easy as it sounds. Giving up, staying out of church, stopping whatever you used to do that you used to love, giving up on God, those certainly are not the right things to do. There are lots of other things that we can do. We can stop trying to force the desired outcome. I have seen, these are things that people have told me they've done. They have followed their prodigal. They have hacked into their email or their Facebook accounts. They have eavesdropped on their phone calls. They have set them up for their priest or pastor to come by just accidentally and catch them at home. There was, many years ago, I belonged to a church in Florida that had a bus ministry. And there was a little guy named Billy. And Billy would come to church on the Sunday school bus ride. His family was not in church. And he must have been about 8. And his little sister was about 4. And every Sunday, they'd have the altar call. And he would drag, Susie was her name, Billy would drag Susie up there. And she's all while she's saying, I don't want to go, I don't want to go, I don't want to go. But he was so concerned about her. Well, that's funny when it's Billy and Susie. But it's not so funny when we're trying to trick and manipulate the result that we'd like to see happen. You cannot force the decision for Christ. We can't. We can't force somebody to do the right thing. If we could, every one of my kids would do the right thing all the time, because I sure tried. Another thing you can do is you can stop telling every person you know about it. Now understand, I am not saying keep secrets. I am absolutely not saying that. And I'm not talking about support groups. If you have somebody in your life, or when you go home and somebody says, who was the speaker, what did y'all talk about? Tell them about the support groups. Look into those support groups yourself. There was another woman who, the kind of thing I'm talking about, I literally saw this with my own eyes. A woman went forward during, I don't know what churches y'all go to, but at the church that I was at, they had an altar call, an invitation, and one woman went up at the end of the service and asked for the microphone, and the preacher gave it to her. And she stood up there and she told the entire church what the person in her life that she was concerned about had done. I just sat there like this. Did she really do that? She did. And what are the chances of his ever going to that church? It's not going to happen. Another thing that you can do, now I'm saying share, but be careful with whom you share. You can also pray, and you know, that sounds like it's a no-brainer. And people often say, well, duh, of course I know you can pray, but think about it with me just for a minute. The God who spoke the universe into existence, he opened his mouth and stars came out of his mouth and formed the universe. A galaxy upon galaxy upon galaxy of things that we cannot even imagine, and that God will stop what he's doing to hear me when I pray. He'll stop to hear you when you pray. To me, that is amazing. The other thing, last thing you can do, you can choose to forgive. And let me tell you what forgiveness is and what it is not. Forgiveness is giving up. I'm giving up my right to hurt Alan for something Alan has done that has hurt me. I'm giving up my right to get back at him. Believe me, if you love a prodigal, there are going to be plenty of times you're going to get to practice this particular skill. You might want to consider, too, that you need to forgive your family members. You know, the ones that don't understand, the ones that don't love your prodigal the way that you do, the ones that don't have the time to listen to you, to help you, to care about how you're hurting. Maybe your friends and your church and your pastor. Yes, I did say your pastor, I repeat. God's army is the only army in the world that I'm aware of that shoots its wounded. And how about this one? You can forgive yourself. I say this, and matter of fact, I said this, I don't know if it's a blog post that I just recently put up or if it's one waiting to be put up, but I never met a parent who got up in the morning. Number one, I've never met a parent who didn't make mistakes. But I've also never met a parent who got up in the morning and said, gee, I think I'll see how I can mess my kid up today. That's just not the way that we roll. That's not it. Let me tell you that you can also forgive your prodigal. I had a pastor in Virginia who told me, we need to forgive because we're going to get sick if we don't forgive. But you know, the problem is not so much our unwillingness to forgive, I think, as it is that we really are frustrated that our forgiveness doesn't make a relationship happen. And the bottom line is it takes one healthy person to forgive. It takes two healthy people to have a relationship. Forgiveness isn't about you at all. I'm sorry, it is about you. It's not about the other person. Quickly, I'm going to touch on some things that you cannot do. You cannot fix your prodigal. You cannot fix the relationship between yourself and your prodigal, or your prodigal and the rest of the family. You can't control your prodigal's behavior. You can't change any person in any way. You can't trick someone into getting saved, getting right with God, or doing the right thing. And lastly, you can't quit. And I'm quickly going to give you some reasons that you can't quit. Okay? Are you still with me?
Yep.
Nobody's fallen asleep from the carbs yet? Okay. I'm not going to tell you there haven't been times when I wanted to quit. It is extremely exhausting to love somebody who brings one crisis after another, after another, after another into your life. You reach the point where you're afraid to answer the phone. If you see a police car just kind of randomly go by your house, you just know they are headed to your house, and they probably are. I've been there too. If you are like me, or if you know someone like me, they have done the rounds of the treatment centers. They have changed the face of their retirement, taking care of grandchildren that their children are not taken care of. I've got a friend in Florida, and she and her husband is 74. He's 74, and she is my age. She's much younger than that because she's my age. They had to adopt their grandkids to keep them from going into the system because the mom had lost parental rights. And that man is going to work until he dies. because those kids are still young. And as my friend Carolyn stood before a judge, the judge looked at her and said, I have one question for you, Mrs. McKay. And she said, yes, Your Honor, what is it? And he said, who's going to raise the next generation? And I'm telling you, this is a serious problem. People are hurting. As much, I really do love the prodigals. And you know what? They love me. But buddy, it was a journey to get to where I could even stand to be in the same room with prodigals because of my own stuff and the things that I had seen. But my heart is for the families who are suffering, and particularly the veterans' families. I was telling somebody this before, with Brandon, before the meeting really got started. I really got a heart for the veterans who come home broken in body, broken in spirit, and they come home to broken families. And the environment is just perfect to have somebody in that family begin to act out. And then our veterans come home really limping along. And they have to deal with things that those of us who have never had to face what they have to face don't know how we're going to deal with. How in the world are they going to deal with it? And these are some of the reasons you can't quit. You can't quit because you can hope in God. Psalm 42:5 says, why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope thou in God. The bottom line is that I'm looking for my notes here. Okay. When all else has failed, you can hope in God. And let me tell you, the battle that is going on is not between you and your prodigal. The battle is going on between your prodigal and your God, his God. And of course, God doesn't have any grandchildren, but the real battle is this way, not this way. Another reason that you can't quit is because God hasn't quit on you. Hebrews 12:2 says to look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. You know, that verse so spoke to me because if you love a prodigal, you're on a first-name basis with shame. Not only do you know all the stunts your prodigal has pulled, but so does everybody else. If your prodigal has broken the law, it's probably been in the newspaper. And man, it hurts. It hurts to see families falling apart. It hurts to see your family falling apart. But God has not quit on you. You know, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus said, God, if it be your will that this cup pass from me, then let it pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. We need to finish. We need to finish the course. Another reason you can't quit is because the people you love are watching you. Wally Beebe was a friend of mine. He led me to Christ, and he and his wife were my first Christian friends. And they loved me. He loved me until the day he died, and she still loves me. Go figure. She does, though. And when my kids were acting out and I was so discouraged, he used to say, you've got to be a rock. And I'd say, I'm not a rock. And he'd say, you've got to be a rock. And I'd say, but I'm not a rock. And he'd say, you absolutely cannot quit. You can't quit. You have to be the last apple clinging to that tree. Because if your kids don't learn from you how not to quit, who are they going to learn it from? And that's what I would say to you. I looked at the spirit that Alan showed up here after the last year's been a tough year, hasn't it? But that isn't what he shows when he talks. He shows he's on the victory side. He shows he's on the overcomer side, and that's a minute-by-minute thing, isn't it, Alan? I know it has to be. But you know what? The people that you love are watching you. And the scripture tells us that we're to teach our children, and it doesn't say teach them when you have devotions in the morning before they go to school. That's great if you do that. I'm glad if you do that. That's not what it says. It says you teach your children when you stand up and when you sit down and when you go in and when you come out and when you rise up and when you go to bed, you teach your children. And what it's saying is that we're teaching our children with our lives. I hope that I'm around long enough to see the kind of courage, the kind of stamina, the kind of stubborn determination that those two girls have when they're grown. Because I know where they will have learned it. Another reason you
Oh,
can't...
that's scary.
Another reason you can't quit is because God has not given you permission to quit. Okay? God is sovereign, and that isn't something that we usually hear about God. You might hear God's mean, and he'll beat you up, and he'll get you if you don't do what's right. Or you might hear that God is good, which he is. He also is sovereign, and he has not given you permission to quit. He hasn't. I've got a friend, some of you may know Ronnie and Sandra Cheapwood, because they lived here for several years and pastored a church. Their oldest son was killed in a car accident. He was killed by a drunk driver. And if any kid should have been okay, this one should. He was a college student, surrendered to missions. He was going to be a missionary doctor. And one night, he was killed by a drunk driver. Sandra told me later on, Sandra and Ronnie and Sandra have been friends of ours for 8 years or so. And Sandra told me that the one thing she learned more than anything else from all of that is that God was sovereign. He isn't some Santa Claus with a white beard who's there to get you out of a jam when you're in a jam. He is the sovereign God of the universe, and he doesn't have to ask your permission to do things. I often check my email. Sometimes I check it several times a day to see if I have an email from God asking my opinion about things. And so far, that has not happened. Now, don't misunderstand me. I have an opinion on most things, but God is not terribly interested in what my opinion is. And guess what? He's not really interested in what your opinion is either. Nobody in the Bible had more problems than Job did. If any person ever had a right to say to God, what in the world are you thinking of? It would be Job. And in fact, Job did finally say, I would that there were a judge to judge between me and God, because he would find on my side. Really, Job? You know, God had not spoken and gotten in this big discussion in the book of Job, until Job said that. And then he had an answer for Job. He said, gird up your loins now like a man, because I'm going to ask of you, and you're going to answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? So, I would just kind of gently remind you that you might not be Shirley MacLaine standing down on the beach screaming, I am God, I am God. Not very effective for her. And telling God what he needs to do about your kid, your spouse, your sister, your brother, your parent. That's not very effective either. I know because I have tried it. Another reason you can't quit is because there's a battle to be won. Don't make the mistake of thinking that this is not a battle. It is a spiritual battle, and you are on the front lines if you love a prodigal. In Daniel 6, it tells the story about how the king had written a law. He'd been tricked into writing a law that said if any man asked something of any god or any person except the king, he was going to be thrown in the lion's den. It says Daniel knew that writing, and he said when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house and he prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Now, I like to think that I am single-minded. I like to think that I'm tenacious. I like to think that I am determined. But Harry and my kids would say I am dog-down stubborn. My head is just like this. If I set my mind to something, you are not going to budge me. Don't you think that it's time that we get our spiritual backs up about the heyday that Satan is having in the lives of the people that we love? Don't you think it's time that we kind of get our backs up about that and plant both feet and refuse to quit just because we're too doggone stubborn to quit? There was a time when I actually said to Harry, tell me how to quit. I don't know how to quit. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I am every once in a while going to have a brat attack, and I'm going to take my sippy cup and I'm going to bang it on my high chair. But if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it on the side of believing God and not giving up, rather than on the side of being a quitter. The last reason that you can't quit is because the story isn't finished yet. Song of Solomon says, "Who is this that cometh up out of the wilderness, leaning on the arm of her beloved?" You know, we are, if you know the Lord, you are the bride of Christ. And this wilderness that you are in is not going to last forever. It's not going to last forever. Truly, it's not. And the time is going to come, if we just abide faithful, when we can come up out of the wilderness, leaning on the arm of our beloved, who has been with us in the wilderness all the time. I got just a couple of closing thoughts, and they go along with the core beliefs of Precious Prodigal. One is that God's purpose is going to be accomplished in the life of your prodigal, whether through his obedience or through his disobedience. I have to tell you, when I prayed that God would give me a son that I could give back to God, I thought I would have a son like Samuel. I did not think I would have a son like Samson. Samson may be the worst son who ever lived. I mean, I could spend the next hour telling you the awful things that he did. But you already know Samson did more for God with his death than he ever did in his life. And he was going to marry the wrong wife, and his parents were absolutely ready to have a cow about that. But Judges 14 says his father and his mother knew not that it was of the Lord. God is going to use that situation that you can't understand for your good and his glory. And God isn't finished with your prodigal, and God isn't finished with you. Your story is not finished yet. Another thought is having joy, that is abundant joy, is God's plan for your life. It's your portion under the sun. In Ecclesiastes, it tells us to live joyfully. And God says that's your portion under the sun. Is it hard to do? Is it hard to live joyfully? When you've had a year like Alan's had, or like my friends Ronnie and Sandra, you buried your child, or your kid is acting out, or you know that when you leave this little haven with your friends and go back home, there's going to be a message on the answering machine that you're glad you weren't there to get. I didn't say it was easy. I said you can do it. And you cannot let it depend on whether or not your prodigal comes home. The last thing I'm going to say is you've been praying for a miracle, and God answers prayer. Maybe the miracle God is going to perform is the difference that you're going to make in someone's life. I live out by the sod farm, out on Golf Course Road. And she used to give the broken pieces of sod away free. And when I found that out, every time we would drive by, I would look at those broken pieces of sod, and I'd like to say I did it with spirituality, but I didn't. I did it with covetousness. But I looked at it and I thought, wow, I could go and I could pick these things up. I could take them home and maybe I could do something with them. One day I was driving by there, and there was a man, a little short man, standing there, and he had a trailer, and I saw him picking up these little broken pieces of sod. I didn't have to look much further than just to see what he was doing and how carefully he was handling those broken pieces of sod. Because I knew what he was going to do with them. I could have followed him home, but I didn't really need to, did I? You wouldn't need to follow him home either. What he was going to do is he was going to take the broken pieces that nobody wanted and just gently place them and piece them together and make something beautiful from them. And God wants to do that in your life and in mine. I'm just a simple person. I've been in the newspaper a lot in Pell City, and not on the arrest page, but on other pages. And I'm asked to speak in a lot of venues, working on a book. But I never thought when I started this project, I never thought that with this book that I'm working on, that Yvette Mayer from Focus on the Family would get involved with little Rita's book. I never dreamed that when I started this blog and just planted both my feet and said, you know what? I may be miserable most of the time. Actually, I'm not. I'm happy most of the time. But my circumstances may not change, but I'll be diddly darned if I'm going to let it get me down. I'm going to do something with it. I'm going to take those broken pieces and I'm going to give them to the Lord and see if He can make something with them. I never dreamed that in 1 month, almost 4,300 hurting people would go to my website to read the simple words of encouragement that I write. I never dreamed that people from 54 countries would reach out and find answers on my blog. Because I'm not a big famous person. And I don't use big $50 words. I just write simple words of encouragement. The answer is this. I took the broken pieces that I had, and all I did have to give Him was broken pieces. And God has made something beautiful with it. If I can find it, I just want to read you one thing, and then we'll let you go. Keep in mind, the story's not finished yet. He's coming home. He'll soon be at the door. Anticipation, oh, the taste is sweet. That I can kiss this child of mine once more, whose love for life the world could not defeat. Nor could this wicked world keep him away. He went away a boy, returns a man, complex and hopeful, living day by day. He's grown in spirit, I must too. I can but live one single life and that my own. And I can learn the balance, love, let go. I too can strive to grow as he has grown. And I can practice what I've come to know. That I can love him much, and that's all right. And I can hold him close, but not too tight. Thank you for letting me share with you tonight. Have any questions? Anybody got questions? Okay.
Very good, Rita. Enjoyed that. Thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule and coming to speak to us. I think it's very good. Very, happiness and joy, and as long as we always keep our joy, that's where God comes in. I really believe that. That happiness, you're gonna go up and down. You're gonna have feelings. You're constantly gonna move up and down. That we can't help. That's just our fleshly side, I believe. So, wonderful job. I'd like to thank everyone for coming again. And remember, our meeting will be the 10th. I'll find out from Jim if we need to do anything as far as supplying the lunch for the cabinet meeting on the 13th of July. And if nothing else, we can go. Yeah. So stay, socialize, whatever you want to do. So, thank you very much.
How many times have you heard that?
Thank you so much. Appreciate it very much.
Listen, that's a perfect joke for you. How many kids?
Thank you.
Thank you, brother.
Thank
I appreciate y'all very much.
Sure, thank you.
How many of them are brothers?